Thank you. That's nice. David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for Consumer Choice Center. It's all yours when you're ready.
Members of the committee, my name is David Clement. I am the North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center. First, I'd like to obviously thank you for allowing for me to provide testimony today. The CCC is a global consumer advocacy group. We advocate on behalf of consumers regarding consumer goods, health and science, digital policy, and mobility, which is what brings me here today. Before I continue, I would like to offer you a quote, and it's a quote in relation to some of the comments that have been made today by some of the other people who have courageously given their testimony. So this is a quote from April 7th, 2021 in Maine to their Transportation Standing Committee on a bill very similar to this. And I quote, "We believe that the state should consider allowing all automakers to sell directly. Automakers are often criticized for not doing enough to sell EVs, yet due to state laws like this, automakers are prohibited from selling EVs to consumers. Again, if the state wants to sell more EVs, then the state should allow all manufacturers to sell EVs directly. We ask the committee to consider an amendment that would allow all automakers to compete on equal footing when it comes to selling EVs. We're just looking to give consumers the choice on how they would like to purchase an electric vehicle." Now, who said that? It wasn't me. It was someone we heard from already today. It was Wayne Wyckel, the Senior Director of State Government Affairs at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And I use that quote to provide some color in regards to the debate that we're having today, just a few months later. Now, several months ago, my colleague Elizabeth Hicks and I published a research report titled the U.S. Electric Vehicle Accessibility Index. It's a national ranking evaluating each state on how accessible the EV market is for consumers. The index evaluates each state's regulations for licensing fees and direct-to-consumer prohibitions. While not the worst state in the country, New York did not fare particularly well, with a score of 5 out of 15, which puts it in the category of barely accessible. And so specifically in regards to this law, which the chairman has specified several times, which I think is very important to specifically address just the specifics of this law, I'll give you 4 reasons why I think direct-to-consumer sales should be permitted for emissionless vehicles. So the first is that the existing market for EVs is not accessible, nor is it consumer-friendly. As it stands, there's only 5 direct sale locations in the entire state, which underserves the residents of upstate New York. But beyond underserving those consumers and raising equitable access red flags, the direct sales limitation and current cap limits limits consumer access to just one brand of electric vehicle. Consumers should have all EV options available to them, be able to purchase those vehicles from the manufacturer of their choice in a way in which they see fit, whether that be from a manufacturer's model from an existing dealer at a dealership owned by a manufacturer or directly from the manufacturer online. And it's important to note that this prohibition, as it currently stands, is a cost-inflating policy. The question has been asked several times, well, why don't these companies simply just involve themselves in the current system, the infrastructure that's already set up? Well, it's a cost-inflating policy. The operation of a standalone dealership increased costs, adds a middleman into the sale process, which inflates prices, which are often passed on to consumers. If we're looking for ways to expedite the EV revolution, policies that artificially inflate the cost of electric vehicles should be reviewed and repealed. Secondly, repealing the limitation on manufacturer direct-to-consumer sales is a necessary step to ensure that New York State meets its own emission goals and that of the federal government, which is especially true given the role and size that New York State plays in that national discussion. As you are all well aware, the Biden administration and the New York Assembly have passed low emission and zero emission sales targets. Federally, President Joe Biden has stated that the goal is that by 2030, 50% of all vehicles sold in the nation will be electric. New York has set a similar goal, but as it stands right now, dealer registration rules act as a huge barrier for consumers who may be interested in purchasing an electric vehicle. If the state takes their interim goal seriously and their long-term goals seriously, they must move forward with this bill and repeal it, because otherwise our concern is that they're putting the cart before the horse. And I apologize for my transportation pun. Beyond the state's goal for EV sales, the same argument can be made in regards to tax credits. These tax credits, which are criticized by some for skewing towards the wealthy, won't have the desired impact if EVs are difficult to buy. This is especially true when we compare New York to other states who do not have this law in place, and many of whom who have recently repealed them. As per our research, there are 22 states that do not have dealer franchise laws, which significantly increases access to electric vehicles and expands consumer choice. Those who are in favor of maintaining this law should have to provide clear and concrete evidence that consumers were harmed and are harmed in those states where the law doesn't exist. Luckily, they can't, because that evidence doesn't exist. It isn't there. By repealing dealer registration restrictions, New York State will be better situated to compete with those states in regards to electrical vehicle access in the race towards an emissionless future. In regards to charging infrastructure, again, the same case can be made. If electric vehicles are difficult to purchase, any amount of money spent on charging stations will be for nothing, because you simply won't have consumers having the availability or the access to have their demand met. The third reason why dealer requirement restriction should be repealed is that in doing so, it could or would also allow for the expansion of purchase online. For reference, direct-to-consumer sales are permitted in the used car market, and consumer demand for these car purchasing platforms has increased dramatically. If we use Carvana as an example, an online company that sells used vehicles, they reported a 37% increase in online purchases, with over 244,000 cars sold through their site in 2020. I think that works out to about one car every 2 minutes. And additionally, that company has also reported that they saw a 24% increase in the purchase of electric vehicles in 2020. These figures show that consumers want, and most importantly, are comfortable with, purchasing vehicles in a direct-to-consumer model that sidesteps the dealer franchise model entirely. This begs the question, why can a resident of New York buy a used car and have it ready to drive and delivered to their home, but someone wanting to purchase a new electric vehicle cannot? I think that discrepancy shows quite clearly that there is a need to repeal this prohibition so that consumer demand can be appropriately met. The last reason why emissionless vehicles should be allowed to be sold directly is that their current business model ensures transparency and price accountability. The existing dealer franchise model, while some have said that there is instances of price competition between dealers, and that can be certainly appreciated, that setup in regards to variable pricing from transaction to transaction allows for pre-existing biases to creep in. This can be problematic from a consumer's perspective. It can also be problematic from a social justice perspective. There have been several examples of where biases, racial or otherwise, have crept in and skewed the buying process for consumers purchasing vehicles in the market as it is now. The direct-to-consumer model, as it is in other states, largely sidesteps many of those issues. Prior to me, the Dealers Association has said that their model is better for consumers. And I'm not here actually to say that one model is better than the other. Their model may be better, but it does beg some very interesting questions. The first is, if their model is better than the direct-to-consumer model, why are they fighting tooth and nail against an inferior model? And the second question is, who decides what is best for consumers? I'll answer that on behalf of consumers. And the answer is we do. Open the market and let consumers decide which model works best for them. Members of the committee, I thank you for hearing our concerns. I urge you to proceed in allowing for the direct sale of emissionless vehicles so that New York's car market can ultimately be more consumer friendly and by extension, more environmentally friendly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for
Sorry, could I just very quickly.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and this was helpful, and again, I'm sorry I had stepped away. But how do you address the concern that was raised about the advocacy that the dealers that did come in today talked a lot about the advocacy with the manufacturer, that's something they could do better than with a direct sale where somebody would have to take on the manufacturer, the consumer would have to take on the manufacturer themselves. If you could address that, I would.
Yeah, of course.
And I appreciate your last, before you answer that, I also want to appreciate your last point about that, or one of your last points about that consumers have repeatedly shown, especially underserved populations or women, often the surveys have shown that they prefer the direct sales because of the transparency and the lack of negotiation. So I appreciate that. And I don't know if you gave a copy of your testimony, but I sure would like to see it. You emailed it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then, yes, if you could address that other piece, I would
Yeah.
appreciate
So,
it.
I mean, if we were to have a scenario where EV manufacturers are allowed to be dealers, then all of the existing consumer protections in regards to that dealership would exist. And that's been mentioned already, lemon law and warranties and things like that. In regards to whether or not the relationship with consumer and manufacturer is equal to or worse than what was advocated for by the Dealers Association, the numbers, if we look at electric vehicles, suggest that that relationship is tolerable or accepted from consumers. If we look at purchasing patterns in New York, I mean, by a factor of 5, EV consumers are choosing to purchase via the direct-to-consumer model over the dealership model. And so if that relationship so sour or was so anti-consumer and consumers were being mistreated by that particular EV manufacturer, which is the example that I'm using, well, then I highly doubt that those people who are passionate about buying electric vehicles would do so in that model when there is another one that they can go to. And we've heard from the association and others that they are strong advocates for this, but the data doesn't suggest that that's what consumers want and the model that they want to purchase electric vehicles from.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We appreciate your testimony. Okay, and last but not least, we have a